Comparing Stalin's collectivization and Mao's Great Leap Forward. Part 1. Two revolutions, one dream, two catastrophes. History remembers certain events not merely because they happened, but because they permanently changed the trajectory of entire civilizations. The Black Death transformed medieval Europe. The Industrial Revolution altered the balance of power between nations. The World Wars redrew maps and reshaped geopolitics. Yet, among the 20th century's most consequential and most controversial experience were the two vast attempts to make agriculture, society, and the economy through centralized political power. Joseph Stalin's collectivization of Soviet agriculture and Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward. Together, these campaigns affected well over 1 billion people. They transformed villages, uprooted centuries old traditions, and dismantled private property, centralized food production, accelerated industrialization, and contributed to two of the deadliest famines in recorded human history. Their legacies continue to influence how economists, historians, policymakers think about state planning, political incentives, and economic development. These were not isolated policy mistakes, they were comprehensive attempts to redesign society itself. At first glance, Stalin and Mao appear remarkably similar. Both emerged from communist revolutions, both viewed capitalism as exploitative. Both believed that socialism required centralized planning, both distrusted markets. Both believed that peasant agriculture represented an obstacle to modernization, and both concluded that only a powerful revolutionary state could transform a poor agrarian country into an industrial superpower. Yet the similarities conceal important differences. Stalin approached collectivization as a calculated instrument of state control and industrial financing. Mao transformed collectivization into a revolutionary mass movement intended not merely to increase production but to reshape human behavior entirely. Stalin believed in disciplined bureaucracy, Mao believed in revolutionary enthusiasm could overcome material constraints. Stalin centralized authority through administrative coercion. Mao attempted to unleash continuous political mobilization. The results would differ in important ways, even as both campaigns inflicted immense human suffering. To understand why these policies emerged, we must first understand the world these leaders inherited. At the beginning of the 20th century, neither Russia nor China resembled the industrial power of Western Europe. Britain possessed military factories, modern industries, railways, steel production, and global trade networks. Germany had become an engineering powerhouse. The United States was rapidly overtaking every industrial economy on earth. Meanwhile, Russia and China remained overwhelmingly rural. In Imperial Russia, nearly 4 out of 5 people lived in villages. Agriculture dominated the economy. Industrial centers existed in cities such as Moscow and St. Petersburg, but they represented islands of modernization surrounded by vast seas of subsistence farming. China's situation was even more rural. More than 80% of the population depended directly upon agriculture. Most farming relied upon family labor, simple tools, and techniques that had changed little over generations. Rural productivity remained low. Population growth continually placed pressure on available farmland. Regional famines were recurring features of Chinese history. Both societies faced the same structural dilemma. How could an overwhelmingly agricultural country compete with industrial powers capable of producing steel, locomotives, artillery, automobiles, aircraft, and modern machinery? For communist revolutionaries, this question was existential. Karl Marx had predicted that socialism would emerge first within advanced industrial economies because capitalism itself would create a large industrial working class. Reality unfolded differently. The first successful communist revolution occurred not in industrial Germany or Britain but in agrarian Russia. The second occurred in an even poorer China. This created a theoretical problem. Marx had described how socialism might replace capitalism. He said relatively little about how poor agricultural societies could become industrial socialist states. That challenge fell to Lenin, Stalin, and later Mao. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, the Bolsheviks inherited a country devastated by war. World War I had shattered the Russian economy. The subsequent civil war caused additional destruction. Factories closed, railroads deteriorated, agriculture production collapsed. Millions died through warfare, disease, and famine. Placed with economic collapse, Vladimir Lenin introduced the new economic policy commonly known as commonly known as the NEP. Rather than abolishing markets completely, Lenin temporarily restored limited private enterprise. Peasants could sell surplus grain after meeting state obligations. Small businesses reopened, trade resumed. Many communist hardliners viewed the NEP as an ideological retreat. Lenin considered it as a tactical necessity. Economic recovery mattered more than doctrinal purity. The policy worked surprisingly well. Agriculture production recovered, cities stabilized, trade expanded, and yet beneath this recovery lay unresolved tensions. Industrial goods remained expensive, agricultural prices stayed comparatively low, peasants often preferred consuming or storing grain rather than selling it. The state required grain exports to purchase foreign machinery needed for industrialization. This created recurring procurement crises. The Soviet government needed grain, the peasants often chose not to sell. This conflict would become central to Stalin's thinking. China experienced its own cycle of instability. The Qing dynasty collapsed in 1911. Instead of producing immediate national unities, China fragmented. Regional warlords controlled large territories. Foreign powers maintained spheres of influence. Japanese expansion threatened national sovereignty. Civil war erupted between the nationalists and the Chinese Communist Party. For decades, political instability prevented sustained economic development. When Mao proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China in October 1949, he inherited an exhausted country. Decades of warfare had devastated infrastructure, inflation had destroyed savings, industrial capacity remained limited. Transportation networks required reconstruction, agriculture suffered from years of conflict. Both Stalin and Mao therefore confronted remarkably similar starting conditions: poor countries, predominantly rural populations, weak industrial bases, hostile international environments, ambitious ideological commitments. Neither leader believed gradual development was acceptable. Time itself appeared dangerous. Stalin repeatedly warned that backward countries invited invasion. He famously argued that the Soviet Union lagged behind advanced nations by decades, had only a short period to close the gap before being crushed. Whether or not one accepts every aspect of his reasoning, Whether or not one accepts every aspect of his reasoning, Soviet security concerns were genuine. Russia had repeatedly experienced foreign invasions. Napoleon marched into Moscow. Germany invaded during World War One. Foreign armies intervened during the Russian Civil War. Strategic vulnerability shaped the Soviet thinking. Industrial weaknesses was not simply an economic problem, it was a military liability. Steel production meant tanks, coal meant factories, electricity meant industrial capacity, machine tools meant weapons. Every ton of grain exported could purchase foreign machinery. Every tractor built represented future productivity. Every factory constructed strengthened national defense. Economic planning therefore became inseparable from national survival. Mao viewed China's circumstances through a similar lens but interpreted them differently. China had endured what Chinese historians often call the century of humiliation. Foreign powers had imposed unequal treaties. Territories had been lost. Japan occupied large parts of China during the Second World War. Communist victory, in Mao's view, offered not merely political liberation but national rejuvenation. Industrialization became synonymous with restoring Chinese greatness. The countryside would finance the cities, agriculture would support industry, the peasantry would transform. The peasantry would become the engine of socialist transformation. Yet, there remained one enormous obstacle: private farming. Throughout history, family farming had encouraged independent decision making. Every household determined what to plant, how much to consume, how much to sell, how much to save. Governments could tax agricultural production but rarely controlled every aspect of rural life. Communist planners regarded this decentralized system as inefficient. Millions of separate producers made coordinated planning almost impossible. How could the state guarantee grain supplies if every family decided independently? How could industrial investment be financed if peasants withheld in harvests? How could modern machinery be introduced across fragmented farms? The communist answer was collectivization. Instead of millions of independent farms, agriculture would continue to become organized into large collective units. Land would no longer function primarily as private property. Production decisions would increasingly follow national plans. Mechanization could expand. Grain procurement had become predictable. Labor had become reorganized, at least in theory. On paper, The concept possessed a certain internal logic. Large farms could benefit from economies of scale. Modern machineries could operate more efficiently. Storage and transformation could become centralized. Scientific farming methods might spread more rapidly. The state could coordinate production according to national priorities. Many economists today would acknowledge that larger agricultural enterprises can sometimes achieve production gains under appropriate institutional conditions. The critical issue was never simply farm size, it was incentives: who owns the lands, who makes decisions, who receives the rewards, and who bears losses. How accurate is the information flowing through system? Can officials distinguish genuine success from fabricated reports? These questions would ultimately determine whether collectivization succeeded or failed. Neither Stalin nor Mao fully appreciated how profoundly incentives shape economic behavior, or perhaps they believed ideology could replace them. That assumption would prove extraordinarily costly. There is another important point, often overlooked. Neither leader initially expected catastrophe. It is tempting, looking backward, to imagine that disaster appeared obvious from the beginning. History rarely works that way. Both governments believed they were pursuing modernization. Both expected agricultural output eventually to increase. Both anticipated industrial expansion. Both promised living standards. Both launched massive propaganda campaigns portraying the future as prosperous and scientifically planned. Millions believed these promises. Party officials believed them, engineers believed them, students believed them, workers believed them. As many foreign observers admired aspects of Soviet planning during the early years of industrialization, the tragedy lies partly in the gap between expectation and outcome. Policies intended to create abundance instead produce scarcity. Campaigns intended to strengthen socialism instead undermined confidence. Attempts to centralize information instead generalized false reporting. Fear discouraged honest feedback. Officials exaggerated success. Higher authorities made decisions using inaccurate information. Errors multiplied. The larger the bureaucracy became, the more difficult correction became. This was not simply an economic failure, it was a failure of institutional incentives. That insight forms one of the central themes of our comparison. Despite the obvious difference between Stalin's Soviet Union and Mao's China, both systems developed remarkably similar problems. Political incentives reward optimism, bad news became dangerous, statistics became political, reality increasingly diverged from official reports. By the time national leaders reorganized the scale of the crisis, millions had already paid the price. In the next part, we leave China temporarily and focus on the Soviet Union during the 1920s. We will examine how Joseph Stalin consolidated power after Lenin's death, why the new economic policy came under increasing criticism, how the grain procurement crisis transformed Soviet policy, why collectivization evolved from one policy option into the defining economic revolution of Stalin's rule. Comparing Stalin's collectivization and Mao's Great Leap Forward, Part 2, Stalin's Road to Collectivization. When Vladimir Lenin died on January 21, 1924, the Soviet Union faced a question that would shape the 20th century. Who would lead the world's first socialist state? Lenin had built the Bolshevik Party into a disciplined revolutionary organization, guided it through civil war, and established the Soviet Union, yet he left no clear successor. Several powerful figures stood ready to claim influence: Leon Trotsky, Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, Nikolai Bukharin, Alexei Rykov, Mikhail Tomsky, and a relatively understated but increasingly powerful administrator named Joseph Stalin. At first glance, Stalin didn't appear the obvious choice. Trotsky was widely regarded as the intellectual giant of the revolution. He had organized the Red Army and was admired for his oratory, theoretical brilliance, and Bukharin was considered one of the party's leading economists. Zinoviev and Kamenev had long histories with the Bolshevik movement. Stalin, by contrast, possessed something far less glamorous and ultimately more decisive: control over the party apparatus. As the General Secretary, Stalin supervised appointments throughout the Communist Party. Every promotion, every regional committee, every provincial secretary, every organizational post gradually became part of an expanding network of political loyalty. Power in authoritarian systems rarely comes from public speeches. It often comes from deciding who receives authority in the first place. Over several years, Stalin systematically built alliances, then dissolved them when they were no longer useful. First, he aligned the Zinoviev and Kamenev against Trotsky. Trotsky found himself increasingly isolated. His criticism of growing bureaucracy failed to generate sufficient support. By 1927, he had been expelled from the Communist Party. Eventually, he was exiled from the Soviet Union altogether. Later, in 1940s, he would be assassinated in Moscow by an agent working for Soviet intelligence. With Trotsky removed, Stalin turned against his former allies. Zinoviev and Kamenev were marginalized. Bukharin became Stalin's next rival. Unlike Trotsky, Bukharin didn't advocate permanent revolution. Instead, he defended Lenin's new economic policy. His advice to peasants became famous: enrich yourselves. Bukharin believed gradual agricultural growth would eventually support industrial development, allowing peasants to produce more, allowing markets to function within limits. Tax agricultural prosperity, use that revenue to finance industrialization. It was a slower path, but Bukharin believed it avoided unnecessary confrontation with the countryside. Stalin increasingly disagreed. The disagreement reflected far more than economics. It reflected fundamentally different assumptions about time. Bukharin believed that the Soviet Union could modernize gradually. Stalin believed gradualism invited disaster. Throughout Russian history, foreign invasions had repeatedly exploited Russian weakness. The Soviet Union remained technologically behind Germany, Britain, and the United States. Its factories were fewer, its railways less developed, its industrial workforce smaller. Its military industry lagged behind potential rivals. From Stalin's perspective, delay itself carried strategic costs. His argument became increasingly explicit. The Soviet Union needed heavy industry immediately. Heavy industry required machinery. Machinery required foreign purchases. Foreign purchases required hard currency. Hard currency required exports. And the only major export available in sufficient quantities was grain. Agriculture therefore became the financial foundation of industrialization. Every ton of exported grain helped purchase machine tools from Germany, turbines from Britain, or industrial equipment from the United States. The countryside would finance the factories. At least that was the plan. Yet reality repeatedly interfered. The Soviet state purchased grain at prices it set administratively. Peasants compared those prices with the cost of manufactured goods. They often concluded that selling grain made little economic sense. Industrial goods remained scarce and expensive. Why exchange valuable grain for products that were either unavailable or overpriced? Many peasants reduced market sales. Some stored grain, others fed more grain to livestock. Some simply consumed a large portion themselves. From the state's perspective, this appeared almost like economic sabotage. From the peasant's perspective, it was rational decision making. Economists describe this as responding to incentives. The government interpreted it through an ideological lens. Communist leaders increasingly spoke of grain hoarding. Many believed wealthy peasants deliberately withheld grain to weaken socialism. This interpretation profoundly shaped Soviet policy. The grain procurement crisis of 1927 to 1928 became the turning point. Harvests had not entirely collapsed. The problem lay in procurement. The state could not obtain enough grain through existing mechanisms. Industrial plants depended upon predictable food supplies. Cities depended upon stable deliveries. Exports depended upon procurement. The entire development strategy began to wobble. Stalin personally visited Siberia during the crisis. Then he authorized extraordinary measures against farmers accused of withholding grain. Officials conducted searches. Grain was confiscated. Coercion replaced negotiation. These emergency actions temporarily increased procurement, but they also convinced Stalin that voluntary market mechanisms were fundamentally incompatible with socialist planning. If peasants retained control over production decisions, the state remained vulnerable. The conclusion seemed obvious to him. Private farming had to disappear. Collectivization didn't emerge overnight. It emerged through escalating frustration. Initially, Soviet leaders encouraged voluntary collective farms. Participation remained limited. Most peasants preferred independent farming. Family ownership had deep cultural roots. Land represented security. Livestock represented wealth. Agricultural tools often passed from one generation to another. Collectivization threatened all of these traditions simultaneously. Resistance should not have surprised anyone, yet ideological conviction sometimes narrows political imagination. Many party officials believed that opposition reflected caste hostility. Many party officials believed opposition reflected class hostility rather than ordinary human attachment to property. This interpretation introduced one of the most consequential categories in Soviet history, the kulaks. Originally, the term referred to relatively prosperous peasants. Definitions varied. Some owned slightly more land, others possessed several horses instead of one. Some hired seasonal workers, some operated mills. Others merely happened to perform better than their neighbors. Over time, the definition expanded dramatically. In practice, local officials often labeled anyone resisting collectivization as a kulak. Economic classification became political classification. Political classification became criminal classification. The category itself became increasingly elastic. One village might define a kulak as someone owning multiple cows. Another might classify anyone opposing local officials. Still another might include families who had once employed labor years earlier. As collectivization accelerated, consistency mattered less than political momentum. Stalin argued that the kulaks constituted a capitalist class within the countryside. If socialism were to succeed, the class had to disappear, not simply lose influence, disappear. This policy became known as dekulakization. Its implementation transformed rural Soviet life. Property was confiscated, homes were seized, livestock redistributed, families were deported, some were imprisoned, others entered forced labor camps. Many were sent to remote regions, including Siberia and Kazakhstan. The precise number affected remains debated among historians, but millions experienced displacement, imprisonment, and forced resettlement during the broader dekulakization campaign. Supporters justified these actions as class struggle. Critics viewed them as mass representation. Regardless of ideological interpretation, the immediate economic consequences proved severe. The Soviet countryside didn't merely lose wealthy farmers, it lost many of its most experienced agricultural producers. Those with larger farms often possessed superior equipment, breeding stock, and farming knowledge accumulated over decades. Removing them disrupted production precisely when the government hoped to increase output. Another unintended consequence emerged almost immediately. Peasants recognized that livestock would soon be collective property. Many responded by slaughtering their own animals before confiscation. From their perspective, losing an animal to slaughter under their own control seemed preferable to surrender it without compensation. The numbers became astonishing. Between 1929 and 1933, Soviet livestock populations fell dramatically. Millions of horses disappeared. Millions of cattle, pigs, and sheep. The reduction crippled agricultural capacity. Horses remained essential for ploughing. Cattle contributed not only meat but also dairy production and draft power in many regions. Livestock losses reduced productivity long before tractors became widely available. This illustrates an enduring principle in economics. Individuals respond not only to incentives encouraging production but they also respond to incentives encouraging destruction. If property rights became uncertain, owners often attempt to preserve value before expropriation occurs. Stalin interpreted livestock slaughter as sabotage. Many peasants viewed it as damage limitation. Neither side trusted the other. Trust once lost is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. Meanwhile, the Soviet state continued promoting mechanization. This leadership envisioned tractors replacing horses. Large collective farms would supposedly operate more efficiently. Machine tractor stations, known as MTS, would own modern agricultural machinery and lease it to collective farms. This served several purposes simultaneously. It concentrated scarce machinery, it ensured technical expertise, it extended state influence directly into rural communities. Machine operators often became political representatives known as agricultural specialists. Technology therefore functioned not merely as an economic asset but an instrument of governance. Propaganda reflected extraordinary optimism. Newspapers celebrated heroic tractor drivers. Films portrayed smiling collective farmers. Artists depicted abundant harvests. Children learned slogans praising socialist agriculture. Collective farms appeared as symbols of the future. This message remained consistent. Private farming represented the past, collectivization represented progress, industrialization represented national strength, the party represented history itself. Yet beneath the optimistic narrative, implementation remained chaotic. Regional officials faced enormous pressure. Production targets rose continuously, deadlines shortened, failure carried political consequences, success brought promotion, and incentive structure emerged that rewarded impressive numbers more than accurate numbers. This institutional problem would later become even more severe in Mao's China, but its foundations were already visible inside the Soviet system. When political careers depended upon meeting ambitious quotas, local officials faced a choice. report disappointing reality, or report politically acceptable fiction. Many chose fiction. At first, these distortions appeared manageable. Eventually, they would become catastrophic. By late 1929, Stalin announced what became known as the Great Break. The new economic policy was effectively over. Market compromise had entered. The Soviet Union would now pursue rapid industrialization and comprehensive collectivization simultaneously. The countryside was about to experience one of the most radical social transformations in modern history. Within a few years, millions of independent farmers would disappear, entire villages would be reorganized, traditional rural life would be overturned. The Soviet leadership would discover that transforming an economy on paper is far easier than transforming millions of human beings.